What is the future for the left after Bernie Sanders?
We have the perfect person joining us to talk about that. Meagan Day, great friend of Rising, staff writer for Jacobin, and co-author of the new book, Bigger Than Bernie, alongside Mike Utrecht. Great to have you, Meagan. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I was going to say I'm doing great as a matter of habit, but in reality, everything is rather terrifying. So I'm doing as well as one can.
As well as possible.
Thank you for being honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little bit about the book and what you wanted to communicate.
Yeah, Micah and I decided to write Bigger Than Bernie at the beginning of Bernie's campaign, actually, and we were betting that, no matter how it turned out, we needed to make the case that the left needed to build on the Bernie campaign and actually, embody the slogan, not me, us, going forward. And so we wrote this book in order to make the case for how we think that needs to happen. And I can give you some details about what's in it if you like.
Yeah,
we would love
please.
that.
So there are a couple of central contentions in the book. The first is that the left needs to be engaging in electoral politics. That's not a terrain of struggle that we can leave to our opponents. We understand that the state under capitalism is sort of inherently structured against our political project. One of the main reasons for this, it's not just the influence channels, as they might be called, the idea that rich people are giving donations and there are social connections and social pressure. It's also the case that the capitalist class has the ability to take their ball and go home and to tank the economy if they don't like the regulations that have been implemented or the policies that have been introduced by a left-wing government. So we understand that it's difficult, but a lot of leftists have looked at that in the past and decided that it wasn't worth engaging in electoral politics. And we're trying to make the case that, in fact, the left needs to engage in electoral politics and that it's not mutually exclusive with what people on the left call building power on the ground, building power in the streets, things like that. In fact, Bernie Sanders' campaign has demonstrated, we believe, that, power can be built in other institutions and in other sections of society, such as the labor movement. It can be built using campaigns, using insurgent campaigns in particular for office. And also, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has started to demonstrate, as have some of the lawmakers in New York and the socialist lawmakers in Chicago who are now on city council in Chicago, that you can use the office to agitate and to organize on behalf of the left. So we're making the argument that the left needs to engage in electoral politics. And we have particular guidelines for how we think that needs to happen. One of the central concepts is this idea of class struggle elections or class struggle candidacies. And those we have three criteria for. The first is that the candidate needs to raise the expectations of working class people for what they might deserve or reasonably look forward to from a society, right? And the second is that a class struggle candidate would be uniting working class people against a common enemy. So it's not these fake calls for harmony. It is divisive. It's just polarizing along very specific lines, along class lines. And the third is that class struggle candidates and class struggle elections need to be leaving movements stronger than they found them. So that's the first argument.
Yeah, let's weigh in on this a little bit, because we haven't actually seen some of that electoral promise through Justice Democrats' efforts in some of the races across the country. And especially, I want to point this out, is on rural voters, non-working class whites who went from Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden in 2020, Jessica Cisneros challenging Henry Cuellar. A lot of these races haven't worked out, frankly, with some of the rhetoric and the policies that you're advocating for. Why do you think that is?
I just think that we're at the beginning of a long process and we haven't built the power that we need to, and it's going to take a long time. We're not going to overnight hit on the winning formula, but I don't think that we should be, for example, evaluating the terrain and deciding to change course based on the fact that it hasn't worked yet. We actually just need to keep pursuing this path. In particular, I think that we need to be focusing on where we are having victories and trying to learn lessons from that. So, for example, in Chicago, getting 6 Democratic Socialists on the city council they're now making up 10% of the Chicago city council. And the people who who voted for them are overwhelmingly working class, in particular working class people of color. This is true not just in Chicago, but it's also true in New York. And it's also true in urban centers in California. And if you look at California, you can see that working class people of color in California broke overwhelmingly for Bernie Sanders. I just think that we shouldn't emphasize one trend over another. We understand that it's actually quite uneven, and we should be learning lessons from our victories as well.
Meagan, what is your thought on this sort of third-party debate? A lot of Sanders faithful look at this whole situation and go, forget it. I'm done with the Democratic Party. They're too far gone. They've realigned themselves around this like professional managerial class, suburban, affluent people. It's too far gone. We need to start a new workers' party that could draw elements from both the Republicans and from the existing Democratic coalition. What do you say to that?
Well, they're completely right in theory. There's no question that we need a workers' party. The reason I say that is because the Democratic Party is what you might call a cross-class coalition. It represents, Blue Cross Blue Shield, but it also represents people who've had their claims denied by Blue Cross Blue Shield. It represents real estate giants like Blackstone, and it represents people being evicted by Blackstone, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a contradiction, and it's true that in the long run, if we want to actually fight for policies that are going to transform the lives of working class people, we're not going to do it through a party that is beholden to the very people whom those policies would cut into their profits. And so they're fighting against them. So if people are correct, that's the correct instinct. But the real problem is one of timing. So the American capitalist class has got itself into a very cozy situation. It basically has two parties devoted to sustaining it. They're split more or less evenly between different industries. You have healthcare and Hollywood and tech over with the Democrats, and you've got oil and gas and real estate over with the Republicans and defense. And then you've also got a split working class based primarily split along cultural lines, geographical lines, racial lines, also between the two parties. So they don't want to blow that up because that's a great situation for the capitalist class. For our part, we need to strategize about how to build a third party in a way that doesn't actually render us completely marginal. Because if we do that too quickly, if we do it at the wrong time, and if people don't follow us, then we'll get crushed because we'll have two parties that are interested in crushing us. So the phrase that I've heard used before from some socialist friends of mine is, it's not a party till there's a crowd. So I would very much like a third party. If Bernie Sanders were to launch a third party bid this summer, I would absolutely support and follow him. But I don't necessarily think that it would be successful. And I think that it might actually be more worthwhile to launch these kinds of insurgent class struggle campaigns that I was talking about, using the Democratic Party ballot line and using them to heighten the contradictions within the Democratic Party. And as we've seen, as Bernie Sanders has demonstrated, to agitate people on as large of a stage as possible, which might have more of an effect in terms of the long-term goal of building a third party.
Mm-hmm. And so, Meagan, as far as I see it in terms of electoral success in that view, it would largely be focused on primarying other Democrats, and especially in safer blue districts. Is that kind of how you see something burgeoning in this movement and taking it over from that stage?
Yeah, I would say at first. I mean, I don't think that there's any reason to not primary people not in safe blue. I mean, you can play with a variety of different strategies. That's the one that appears to have the most success so far. And like I said earlier, I think that we should be learning from our successes. I think that the more successes we get under our belt, the more we can build off of it and iterate and experiment, right? Yes, I think that we should be pursuing an electoral strategy that looks somewhat similar to AOC's insurgent campaign against Joe Crowley. And I think that DSA in particular has a major role to play, and it needs to step up in this moment and fill the really big shoes left behind by the Bernie Sanders campaign. And the reason I say that is because the Bernie Sanders campaign has basically been acting as a surrogate party for progressives, and in its absence, one way or the other. I mean, this is even true if Bernie Sanders were to become the nominee and to win in November. Without the campaign, we don't have an institution that can hold progressives and left-wingers and socialists and working class advocates all together. And
That's
so we
true.
need to be building some kind of institution that can actually substitute. And I think DSA is the best poised for that because we are a democratic organization. We're the largest socialist organization in half a century in this country, and we're ready to absorb new members.
Meagan, let's layer on top of this the obvious thing that is unfolding before us, which is this massive pandemic with huge, Great Depression-like economic ramifications, where suddenly the ideas that we were being told from Bernie Sanders were so radical seem almost small ball in comparison to what needs to urgently happen right now, and what even some, conservatives like Mitt Romney are now saying, like, cash payments immediately, yes, please. What is the appropriate sort of role for leftists in this moment? How can we make sure, because to me there's two possible outcomes. There's the sort of Great Depression outcome, where out of it you build this durable social safety net out of the New Deal that forms the basis for, a broadly shared prosperity in the middle class. Or you can go the Great Recession way, where essentially all of the trends, the inequality that was rising prior to the Great Recession was all accelerated. The big firms got bigger, the small guys got crushed, working class people got crushed. How do we make sure that we have an outcome coming out of this crisis that leads to a more broadly shared prosperity and more working class power?
So that is the question that we're facing right now. We're basically in a moment very similar to what Naomi Klein has described in the shock doctrine. It's just that, amazingly, and I think due in large part to just the absolute state of disarray of American working class life, but also the agitation of the left, and in particular of Bernie Sanders through his presidential campaigns, we're in a situation where it's not clear that it's going to break in favor of neoliberalism and the neoliberal agenda of privatization and austerity. It is possible instead that we're going to end up with the kind of New Deal outcome from this crisis, that it's going to break instead in favor of social democracy. We have some promising signs of this, ironically, in the form of many people who have been extremely hostile to Bernie Sanders now insisting that we implement some kind of emergency version of the platform that they were very hostile to just a couple weeks ago, or that they remain hostile to in the long term. So, and popular opinion seems to be following them. People seem to be very interested in demanding free healthcare, free childcare, unemployment insurance, paid sick leave, suspending or canceling debt, a moratorium on evictions, moratorium on foreclosures. These are things that are basically miniature or temporary versions of Bernie Sanders' entire platform. The superior wisdom of universal programs is being discussed on a much larger stage than ever before. And it's not just an ideological debate, right? It has immediate ramifications for the lives and livelihoods of working class people in this country. As for what the left needs to do to make sure that it breaks in our favor, this goes back to the question of Bernie Sanders' campaign basically being a surrogate for a workers' party right now. If we had a workers' party, if we had a developed workers' party, then it and its representatives could agitate in the halls of power and could organize on the ground. And that would probably be the most effective way for us to end up with a favorable outcome. Unfortunately, we don't. What that means is that Bernie Sanders needs to not drop out, because his campaign is actually serving the function of the institution without which we would have to scramble to build. We wouldn't be able to build it in time. This is a crisis. It's an emergency. And we need Bernie Sanders and his campaign to be doing educational live streams and bringing in, labor leaders. We need them to be doing like virtual town halls like they did last night, bringing in progressive and left-wing lawmakers and speaking to people who are highly invested in this stuff on the ground, people who have class consciousness. Class consciousness workers in the United States are listening to these labor leaders and these electoral leaders. This is the exact kind of thing that we need to be doing right now in order to build the forces that we need to push it in the right direction. And so ultimately, I would say that one of the criteria is that Bernie Sanders has to stay in.
Yeah,
well,
I think that's well said. Meagan, thank you so much, guys. Buy the book,
Thanks,
Bigger
Meagan.
Than Bernie. They were kind enough to let me put a little blurb on there, so I highly recommend it. And Lord knows people have time on their hands at the moment. So.
Time to read. Thanks,
Great
Meagan.
to see you, Meagan. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.
And we're going to have more Rising for you after this.